This is one historical example, once again quite well known, which is many people don't realize that IT has been around for a long time. Did you know that the word computer actually referred to a human being first? A computer was a professional word like lawyer or accountant. So a computer has existed for a very long time in referring to the job done by a human being. So you could be a computer just the way you could be an accountant or a lawyer or a doctor. So back in the day, before electronic IT existed, there were still Hollerith machines and so on, and Dehomag was an IBM subsidiary in Europe. And there was a lot of census data collected in Europe, especially in Germany during the Weimar Republic and so on. And IBM worked with the Nazis to accurately identify Jews using census data. And that helped the Jews carry out their pogroms and their Holocaust. And there was a very well-known book written about this, which is in the references at the end, which you can look up. And this is actually a bit of sorry history. And it actually tells you one important lesson to be learned, that IT is not always clean. IT has not historically always been clean. And I hope, of course, in the entirety of our lifetimes and all of human history to come, this sort of thing never happens, but it can happen. It has happened once. And that's something that we need to keep in mind. Okay, and then machine learning, once again a buzz phrase that many of us have heard and some of us may have worked on also. So how is machine learning working? In many cases we don't really have very good curated data sets. We don't really know what to learn and how to learn. So in many cases we are actually using crowdsourcing and so on. We use Amazon Mechanical Turk and various other ways of doing it. But crowdsourcing is not a very good way to learn ground truths, much less to learn good values and good taste. And there was a very well-known example of this just a couple of years ago where Microsoft, of all companies, put out a bot which would learn, it was a Twitter bot that would learn behavior from other users, and it became a very badly behaved bot. It started using some very foul language and so on, racist language, stuff like that. So this is the bazaar model. There is a very well-known book written at the, I think, late 1990s, around 1999, called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. These are two different models of development, especially for IT, but in general, where the cathedral model is there was some 14th century French architect who came up with a model, who came up with the design for a cathedral, and for more than 100 years, people followed that design and built a grand cathedral according to that design. The bazaar model is you go in a bazaar. There is no real structure there. You just pick up pieces wherever you can, and then you build something with it using the ideas of different people. So the bazaar model of algorithm development also has drawbacks, because you're actually giving up a lot of your freedom, and you're getting answers from many other people who may or may not have the right answers themselves. And this is once again a very well-known example. This is actually a quote from that. The blind application of machine learning runs the risk of amplifying biases present in data. And then this is one very well-known paper from NIPS last year, where they find that there are implicit biases, correlations in word embedding. So for example, a man is identified as a computer programmer and a woman is identified as a homemaker. And why is this happening, by the way? By the way, we know that this is wrong, but why is it happening? Because in fact, most computer programmers are men. I'm not saying that's exactly the way it should be, and then most women are homemakers, and the algorithm is actually judging that based on the facts. It's not actually making a value judgment about this at all. But then this word embedding, this mapping in some senses is not quite what we want it to be. That's what is happening here. And I just mentioned the bazaar model. The other model is, of course, the cathedral model, where software is created by a centralized design process with a certain structure, and almost all of your major operating systems like iOS and even Windows and other things, they're all built in this. And such software is typically proprietary. We don't have really any way to inspect what is going on inside them. There may be all kinds of hooks and backdoors and questionable ethics and so on happening inside there. And FOSS software, free and open source software, is in the bazaar model with very little centralized control, where you have some code being open to inspection, and then we can actually change something. We can actually fork the project and come up with a different way of doing that. Unfortunately, all this doesn't really happen too often. In theory, that code is open for inspection, but how many of us have actually honestly looked at the Linux kernel, for example? Have you? I know I haven't done that in years, and even when I did, it was probably not that closely, right? So the bazaar model is hypothetically better in some cases. It allows you to do more things. It gives you more of your democratic rights and so on. But typically, there are not enough people investing enough time to make this work very well. And then next thing is about surveillance and privacy. So algorithms can also be used to track people's movements and behavior. You know that you must have noticed this. Many times when you visit a website like Flipkart or something and you buy an item, you see the ad for the same item in so many other websites that you visit. How is that happening? Cookies, where you visit a website and they place a cookie, and then throughout your web sojourn, your behavior can be tracked and it notes exactly what you're up to. And that is actually, in some senses, an invasion of your privacy. It knows your behavior. And by the way, that is something that you probably don't share even with your close friends. Do you always tell your friends where you're visiting, all the websites that you visit, in what order? Some of that you would say, not really any of your business, what I'm doing. But then these online companies actually know that. And they're tracking you online so much. And then you also get photographed many times a day, thanks to CCTV and so on. So, and because all of us carry phones, right, these days, and those phones are always on, you can, or some company can find out my location accurate to within a few meters, all hours of the day and night. Think about that. Same for all of us. Even your spouse or your best friend would not know that much about you. So people's privacy is invaded dozens of times a day. And
we see we know Google Maps and all, they collect data throughout the day when your Wi-Fi and location services are on. But if we do not provide them with data, how will they get us correct prediction, correct recommendation if we do not supply them with data, if we keep our location services off? And
that is certainly the argument that these companies would make, and there is some justification for that argument. I don't deny it, but the counter argument to that is that number one, they are often collecting data quite in excess of what they need to provide those services. So that's not completely true. So it is accurate to say, yes, you need to give up a little bit of privacy so that you can get a service, right? That part is okay, but you don't always need to give up as much of your privacy as they're demanding to get the service that you're getting. That's one. Second thing is that having collected the data, why do they then hoard it? They don't actually make it available to anyone else. They don't actually release it even to you. Can you ask for your data back? Can you say, I want you to erase all my data from all your servers and get rid of it? And can you say, give me all the data about myself? After all, I think India, I don't know what the status of the law is. I am not really up to speed on that. Maybe some of you who are studying law, you can tell me. But in Europe, for example, they are saying that the person, the individual, is the owner of their data. So they can actually request, not just request, they can demand that the company erase their data, and they can also get their data from the company if they want.
But the services that we are using, like the Gmail we use, the WhatsApp we use, these services are completely free. So basically, as they say, if you are not paying for these services, you are actually the product. So I mean, we cannot, in a way, we cannot ask them to raise the data because they are providing us the services for free. So I mean, they can collect this much amount of data.
They need consent from it.
So they always ask for consent.
No, typically what happens is there is a long checklist and say agree, don't agree. You always click agree and go on. You don't actually bother to read that 7 or 8 pages worth of text at all. And even if you do, someone like me certainly doesn't really understand most of what we read, right? That's a big problem. And yes, I agree, okay, there is no free lunch. If you are actually getting a service, then you're obviously giving up something for it. At the same time, for example, would a company like Hotmail or Google give us a choice of saying, okay, I'll pay $100 a month or whatever it is, or maybe not $100 a month, that would be too high, but 100 rupees a month, let's stay with that, and say, okay, don't track me. Don't do anything that I don't want you to do. Don't invade my privacy at all, but I will pay for the service. Exactly what you're charging, what you're getting from me otherwise. They should snap up that opportunity if they're really honest about it. In practice, they probably won't.
They do not guarantee it directly, but we kind of have like, Gmail, we have like corporate accounts.
Yeah, I do have. In fact, and many company, and in fact, our institute has not just Gmail. We used to have Gmail. Now we have Office 365. I have a Gmail account, corporate Gmail account through somebody else. So, but anyway, so there are such things. But the fact of the matter is, this I don't think has a closed loop answer at the moment. It is something we need to discuss. It's something you need to think about. That's all I'm saying.
Coming up with the GDPR.
Right. Yes.
No, and the point really, that, I mean, the takeaway from your talk also is that there are, if billions of people are making these trade-offs simultaneously for the free service and giving up large volumes of data, there are large-scale like consequences of that. And the examples that you gave in terms of in terms of reinforcing certain biases, in terms of large-scale governance-related issues, what happens when the entity is not just a corporation but the government? We'd have like the ethical or the questions become much more apparent. But
Yeah.
really, what we're getting from you is that there are when simultaneously we are making individual ethical choices, there are large-scale snowballing consequences.
There are issues which are, in fact, thank you. I think your points are well taken. But my point, once again, from my perspective is, in many cases, people like me, people who were trained the way I was, I went all the way to a PhD in computer science. I studied at reasonably good schools without ever having to think about this, where nobody ever told me that you actually need to think about how algorithms work in a social context, what the effect of your work or somebody else's work like this will be, where the consequences of society actually meet people's expectations, where not just technological but social aspects also play a role. And what I'm realizing, and what I think that's a realization that I want to share with you, is you should think about these things. And that's why it's also, of course, quite interdisciplinary. It's not just a computer science issue. Anyway, so coming forward, let's, I think, move on. And of course, reselling is a big issue. Okay, now reselling data without telling you, a lot of people have objections to that, where you actually start getting phone calls from companies that you have never heard of. Why is that happening? Because somebody who got that data from you, you dropped your card into somebody's fishbowl or something, where you shared your number with somebody, then sold your data to somebody else. Once again, think about that. You probably don't give out your cell number that easily to just anyone who asks. You don't put it in public places. You don't share it with anyone who asks. But then somebody else who has that data is selling it without asking you. Certainly, I would find that, and I do find that, quite objectionable. That's not good. Okay, and then other issues which I will briefly go over. Censorship, once again, that's very easy to do, because if you are only dependent on the internet for your information and you don't actually have physical resources at all, then you can be censored very easily. Because suppose Google says, I will not show any results that actually deal with a particular political philosophy. I will not show any work that refers to this school of thought. Then they can. We don't even know about it. And restrictions on freedom of speech, once again, this is the Great Firewall of China. The gentleman in the morning was talking about this, where China does not allow Google or Baidu, they don't allow Google or Facebook or any of that. They have the firewall where they censor all criticism of the Communist Party and so on. And that can happen in more subtle ways, not just in China, but everywhere else also. Digital rights management, that's a term that came up a lot, once again, around the year 2000 because of all this Napster and online music, MP3. The MP3 format was a major breakthrough because it allowed people like you and me to copy a high quality audio file and play music on our personal system. That was why it was a big breakthrough. And then the recording industry in the US was quite alarmed. The recording industry is a profit-making industry. They give a lot of money to well-known recording artists, but otherwise it is not a very fair stakeholder. And they actually enforce digital rights management, and they prevent innovation because they want to have access to all the content. They don't necessarily do this out of any greater motive. They're, I suppose, as ethical or unethical as most companies are. They are driven by corporate greed. They're not They're not trying to do a bad job for themselves. So therefore, they actually have restrictions on sharing. And of course, you can also have restrictions on democratic rights. Once again, if you are censored online, your opinions are not allowed to be expressed. That's a restriction on your democratic rights. And similarly, if you have voting systems that use the internet or some aspect of the internet and you find a way to meddle with them, then that also can be a problem. Okay, and now a couple of closing comments. This was something that my good friend Bidisha also talked about in the morning. In general, in service systems, you need good mechanisms as well as policies. And once again, computer scientists and so on tend to focus only on mechanisms. And the classic example of this is with locks and keys. Now, if you have the technology that allows you to lock a door, or by any technology, now that can be the classical locking technology which we have had for hundreds of years, or it can be some swipe card or something else, that is a mechanism. Now, who has which key to which door? That is policy. Should I have the key to your office? Should you have the key to my office? Should we have a key to this building? Should somebody else have the key to some closet? That is policy. There is nothing in the mechanism itself that dictates what the policy should be. And that is an important distinction to make. So the access privileges that you give, that's a policy. And you need to make that choice based on the policy. And you need to find the appropriate policy in a certain context. And not every policy can be enforced given a mechanism. That's important. So sometimes you may have policies that you think are very well founded, which are very sound policies, but the technology does not exist for them yet. And once again, let me go back to my earlier remark saying that you need the technology and the economic feasibility. So there may be certain policies which require a technology that is not economically feasible. So for example, I can have a policy that says everyone should be completely safe on the road. There should never be any accident. That means every car should be built like a tank. So in the event of any collision, there will be no hurting anyone inside. But that will be economically infeasible. That car will never actually sell in the market. So not every policy can be enforced given a mechanism, and not every policy that can be implemented is actually appropriate. The other side also is true. So sometimes mechanisms allow you to implement certain policies which are not the right policies to implement. So policies, of course, also have to evolve as our society evolves. And so a mechanism is also agnostic to policy. For example, we have segregation of restrooms by gender, men's and women's. But you don't want to segregate by race, whites only and non-whites. That used to happen in the US and some other countries not too long ago, maybe 100 years ago, even more recently. And that we would say is completely no-no. You don't want that, you don't tolerate that, that's not regarded as appropriate in any way, but the mechanism would be exactly the same in both cases. So policies have an important role to play. You cannot just think about the technology that is used, you also have to think about the policy that is being enforced. So this is my, I think, absolute last slide. Algorithm development and software engineering and so on, generally speaking, they are considered technical problems only. And once again, that's the kind of education that I have, and in fact, for the most part, I impart to my own students, where we think about the technical aspects of how algorithms work and how certain things need to be constructed, but that's all at the component level. We need to think about that beyond that and think about building computing services and not just individual components. And we have to appreciate the difference between mechanisms and policies and let the policy guide how the mechanism is actually deployed. And algorithms have the tendency to help as well as to hurt. They can do both. You need to think about that as you go along. You cannot just trust that the algorithm will always do the right thing. And laws and policies for all this are actually well behind the curve. Technology evolves very fast, laws change very slowly. That also is a problem, I think, something that some of you probably know much more than me. And this also has to change. This is the impetus for us to improve society, where we have better policies and better laws to do certain things. Okay? Any questions? I'll be happy to take them. Any further questions? I'll also briefly go over, let me do that. I'll just mention the references. I suppose at some point this slide deck can be made available, or some references can be made available to them also. So this is a book that came out earlier this year about how algorithms actually have a social context. I don't think this book is actually the last word on the subject, but it's a very interesting book. You should try to look at it sometimes if you can. And this is a very well-known ProPublica article from last year where they actually went into, this was actually a big news item at the time, where they found that sentencing for criminal defendants was actually biased when it was done by an algorithm. So that was this. And this Roger Penrose book is actually a few decades old now. Penrose is actually a very well-known physicist, and he's a colleague and friend of Stephen Hawking, whom I think many of us have heard of. And he wrote a book in response to the claims about strong AI, where people said that human beings are nothing but machines and Turing machines will eventually do everything that a person can and all that stuff. So then, you heard of the famous story of the emperor's new clothes? Yes? The emperor who was supposed to be wearing these really fine clothes turned out to be not wearing anything. So that was a pun that he's made here, the emperor's new mind. So he's saying that, okay, you're saying that an AI system actually has a mind, but that's the emperor's new mind. That there's no real mind there, that's what this is. That's the pun in the title. And then this is a known, this is a reasonably good paper. Actually, he only gives you a bunch of definitions, but it's still okay. You can look at this for some insight into what algorithmic culture is. And this is a very well-known book from many years ago, not too many, but earlier this century, where he came up with the study on how IBM actually collaborated with the Nazis on identifying Jews and things like that. And there are numerous things about algorithm-based marketing and how they are not very good, and this is one example of that. This is by no means the only paper. And this is a news article in the New York Times about how Microsoft Twitter bot actually misbehaved once they let it go. They actually had to pull it down after about a day because it learned behavior from many bad people who were misbehaving online. And Eric Raymond is an open source vocationary, and he actually advocates for this, and he came up with this book. And Richard Stallman, of course, many of us have, you know who Richard Stallman is? He is one of the gurus of open source also, and he has this thing called the Free Software Foundation and GNU. So he actually has a video here. That's the link for that. And that's the very well-known title from the 1980s, If Writers Can't Program and Programmers Can't Write, Who's Writing User Documentation? And then in the 1980s or even before, there was actually, this is actually a very interesting historical article, because it turns out that there were very serious claims about how good AI would be even back in the 1970s and 80s. And in the 1970s, someone actually wrote saying that in the future, you will never need to be educated because computers will do all the thinking for you. And they were saying that about the year 2000. In the year 2000, which is now well in our past, they were saying, you will not need to know how to read because the machine will do the reading for you. So anyway, this guy in 1980, he wrote an article which critiqued that. And it's a very funny, very well written article. And Sipser is a book, I think many of us who have done some CS, you know this already. It's a book that you look at about Turing machines and stuff like that. And this is a famous NIPS paper, Man is a Computer Programmer as Women is to Homemaker. It caused a big splash last year when it came out. And this is the district court judgment about the Houston school district that I mentioned in the beginning. And this is an article about the digital divide. Not an article, it's a book actually about the digital divide. Anyway, thank you. And any questions, feel free. Yeah. I don't think there's a speaker here. They're using that, yeah. That's only for the recording, yes. Even my mic doesn't actually go to any speaker as far as I know, yeah.
So I was interested in the crowdsourcing part that you were talking about. The crowdsourcing part, the decisions are taken together from crowdsourcing platforms. Right. So regarding that, two kinds of decisions, right? One kind of decisions is where people will know the decisions by discussing them. As in we can arrive at a proper decision by discussing them. As in they have an inherent solution which can be discussed.
Right.
And some problems like that autonomous cars and things like that, and whom to save and whom to not save and things like that, where it's very tricky, and even after discussions we might not really end up with a correct answer or ethical answer that everybody agrees on. So I'm thinking of crowdsourcing in these two different contexts. Like in one context, crowdsourcing, as you say, I might agree that it might not be good, but in the other context where there are autonomous cars and things like that, is it a, what I mean, I'm asking for your opinion if it's a better way to do it, because I just came across one particular project from MIT. It's called Moral Machines, where they're trying to build take open source data from decisions from people about training autonomous cars in such situations. So what would you think?
I don't know that much about autonomous cars, to be quite honest. And to my knowledge, to my limited knowledge, autonomous cars are not a major use case or domain for crowdsourcing. There may be some particular problem there which requires crowdsourcing, but crowdsourcing is used in a couple of different cases. For example, one case is where they have, you know what CAPTCHAs are? CAPTCHAs are those irritating figures that they show us, and that is supposed to distinguish between people and bots, right? So in some cases, if you want to prevent a bot from signing up for something and using an account and so on, they make sure, supposedly, that you're a person by asking you to solve that CAPTCHA. And in fact, now that CAPTCHA framework itself is gradually collapsing because deep learning is making it possible to get bots that will actually solve the CAPTCHA as well as a human being. But classically, at least for the last 15 years, CAPTCHAs have been used for that purpose. So what Google has done, I think the Google Books project or some other cases, is they actually show you snippets of text. And they ask people to identify what the text reads. And they use crowdsourcing to essentially do OCR. Not really OCR, they get the ground truth for that. So they will show the same image to 10 people, and they will get the majority opinion about what that text is, and they will use that in their to get the data for their OCR or whatever it is. And that's actually a case where crowdsourcing makes sense. Where it makes less sense is where you have cultural norms or truths or norms of behavior, where once again, like the Microsoft Twitter bot, where people who are online may or may not be behaving in the way that you want to train your machine to behave. So if you're learning subtle truths like that, if you're learning ground truths or behavior, modes of behavior that are socially constructed and they're not scientific truths, in such cases, you're probably on shaky ground using crowdsourcing. Using Mechanical Turk or something like it for OCR and so on, or Google for OCR using CAPTCHA and so on, there you're on more solid footing because those are not cultural constructions. Those are either that letter is L or it's not, and we can agree or we can disagree. And if 8 out of 10 people say it's an L, it's probably an L, and we can go with that. That part will work. But if a certain word is not appropriate to use in polite company, but that bot learns that from a lot of people who are loosely using it, they're maybe not the right company for that bot at that moment. Just like a child, right? You don't want the child to learn foul language. Therefore, I think those of us who are, you guys may be too young for that, but some of us who have children, we think about this all the time. I don't want to let loose with a lot of foul language in front of small children because they learn from me and they might learn the wrong thing from me. So the same thing about crowdsourcing in the context of behaviors. So my very rough answer to you would be, when you are on solid ground in terms of ground truth, if that's not a social or cultural construction, if it's that clear, like a letter of text which is in some grainy image that you're trying to decipher, that I think crowdsourcing will work very well for. If it's cultural, I would be a little more careful because I don't know the culture of the people from which it is imbibing that.
What I was getting at actually. So we talked about two kinds of ground truths. That is, one is what we know for sure, most likely what it is going to be, and the other one is very shaky based on the cultural norms that were there. So I'm talking about a context where there are no ground truths, like trolley problems per se. So that in that cases, should we rely on crowd information? What would people do in such cases?
Yeah, I suppose, but if you want to stick with autonomous cars and so on, once again, if you learn the ground truth in Bangalore, or if you learn the crowdsourced behavior in Bangalore and you apply that in New York, you'll probably end up with some very undesirable conclusions. And also the opposite, in the sense that the behavior or the norms in a particular society, including driving behavior and the behavior of pedestrians and drivers and so on, can be quite different based on the local society.
So these driving patterns can be given a ground truth, right? But I'm talking about more ethical issues kind of thing. So
No, I don't know how you can actually, I'm not an ethicist and I don't really have a very good foundation in ethics. Maybe someone who does can opine on this. But I don't think ethics in general are determined based on crowdsourcing. Because that can become problematic, because just like scientific truths are not fixed based on democratic, shall I say, outcomes, right? You cannot actually poll a number of people and find out what a scientific fact is. I don't think, and this is me speaking without having the background in ethics, that you cannot fix an ethical outcome by a crowdsourced answer. I think it will at most tell you what most people think the ethics of that situation is, but that may or may not be the correct answer. You need an ethical framework, and I think there are people who study that. Unfortunately, I'm not one of them, so I don't have a very good answer for you.
Just a curious question. You said that Google, used captchas to, create OCR, the Google books they had.
Mhm.
So how did it validate the text that we entered for the captcha? Because it needs to, say yes or no, was the captcha correct or not? So how did it validate, like, if you entered the captcha, was it correct or not? Because it is, learning from you.
Right.
So how will it say, tell you that you are a human or not? The purpose behind it.
I don't really completely know that because I'm not involved in this project and I've not really studied it, but I know that this particular concept has been used in this way.
Even I read about it. This is the,
I don't know. I'd have to look it up because this was, I think, some 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
It's not even very recent. It has been done. That's all I can tell you. I really don't know the details of how it happened. Yeah. I think that lady wants the mic.
Just a quick comment, which is that it's just interesting that if we go back right to the beginning of your talk and like what you began with, which is that by definition or by nature itself, algorithms are about supplanting human decision making. Like that's just, the point is to automatize a certain sequence a certain sequence of procedures and so on, right? So it's just, we are now, and then if you skip back to the end where you're looking at like the problematic or the outcomes at a much more political, social plane, that the questions just become a lot more trickier because it's almost like by nature the technology is supposed to displace human decision making, and that it is embodying judgment that one does not entirely have control over, and now we're sort of taking issue with that, right? So that push and pull between the nature and by definition the innate character of the technology itself, and then the almost like its logical outcome or the logical consequences. I think it just becomes it's just a very powerful example to show that technology is not neutral and that it is not that it is not kind of an objective kind of absolute self-evident truth, but it is from the get-go embedded in our social and cultural context.
Yes, very much so. And sort of as almost a closing thought, I would say, as I said before, one of the big reasons for AI and automation is it's not that companies want to make a profit, and that profit often arises when you reduce the workforce, when you have a leaner workforce. Yes, there is that aspect to it. But the major push for AI and automation is not only that. It is because once again, Facebook is now serving 1 billion plus people, but their workforce cannot really scale in proportion. So if you have a company like Facebook that serves only 1 million people, it will still have probably something close to the same workforce. And Facebook cannot really hire 1,000 times as many people to serve a much larger workforce, much larger customer base. That's the problem. So in many cases, you have to automate to serve the number of customers who actually want the services you are trying to offer. And that means that there is no really getting away from complex systems and AI. That's the major push for this. And in many cases, people want what you and I would call as intelligent services. We don't really have a very thorough definition for AI, but one definition that that seems to work in many contexts is, if you would associate a human being with intelligence, if he or she did that, and if a system does that, if a machine does that, then you can call that as being AI, artificial intelligence. So what do you define as intelligent for a human being? Play chess, plays very good chess, plays music, creates music, something else like that, something which you think is a skill or a talent or very high quality intelligence. So if something like that can be done by a system, including decision making for some of these contexts and so on, and if such a process can be replicated by an algorithm, then that algorithm also has AI. Or the system has AI, to be more precise. That's one working definition. And so we need AI precisely because there are not enough people available to do all those things. There are not enough people for 6-7 billion of us to be served with all the things that we want. That's the catch. Okay, thank you. Been a very fine audience. Thank you.